Friday, July 24th, 2026. It's the 205th day of the year, and a storm threat that looked contained just yesterday is about to expand across a much bigger stretch of the map. What starts today as a narrow corridor over the Central Plains is going to widen by the weekend into a risk area covering more than 25 million people from Kansas City to Pittsburgh. So let's get right into it. The setup begins today with a modest severe threat over central Kansas and Nebraska. There's a 15% severe outline covering roughly 4 million people from Salina and Hastings down through Wichita. This is riding along the nose of a ridge that's been parked over the southern plains all week, with a weak disturbance sliding out of the Rockies and running smack into a very humid air mass sitting at the surface. We're talking 2,500 to 3,000 joules of storm fuel, which is more than enough to support a few strong to severe storms once the cap breaks this afternoon. The main threat today is large hail, the kind that can total a car windshield, along with a couple of gusty downburst winds. It's not the big story, though. The big story is what happens to this same disturbance as it tracks east into the weekend, because the atmosphere is going to load up behind it, and that's when the real expansion happens. By Saturday, the same wave that fired storms over Kansas is going to dig into a much richer pool of moisture sitting over Missouri and Iowa, and that's when this threat widens out considerably. We're now talking about a 30% risk area covering close to 12 million people from Kansas City and Columbia through Springfield, Illinois. The engine behind this is a strengthening low-level jet setting up overnight Friday into Saturday, which is going to pump warm, humid air north. At the same time, a shortwave trough digs south out of the northern plains. When those two things line up, you get exactly the kind of overlap that turns scattered storms into an organized, dangerous complex. What has my attention with Saturday is the timing. Storms look to fire during the afternoon, somewhere near the Kansas-Missouri border, and then as they move east into the evening, that low-level jet is going to strengthen underneath them and effectively weld individual storms into one long line. That's usually the recipe for a squall line capable of widespread damaging winds, and in this case, there's a real chance it holds together well into the overnight hours as it pushes toward St. Louis and into southern Illinois. This is still day 3 guidance, so some of the placement is going to shift around before Saturday actually arrives, but the ingredients are lining up in a way that deserves real respect. If you're anywhere in that corridor and storms do end up rolling through overnight, you need something that's actually going to wake you up. Because overnight, severe weather is exactly when people get caught off guard, sleeping through a warning that would have had them in a basement if it had come through at 3 in the afternoon instead of 3 in the morning. Now here's where the expansion really shows up. As this system continues east Sunday, the same energy that produced Saturday's line is forecast to run straight into an already unstable air mass sitting over the Ohio Valley. That combination is what pushes the risk area out to cover more than 25 million people by Sunday afternoon and evening, a corridor running from Louisville and Cincinnati through Columbus and up into Pittsburgh. The severe outline is still preliminary at this range, but there's growing model agreement on a broken line of storms moving through during the afternoon commute and continuing into the evening, with damaging wind gusts as the headline threat and a low but real tornado risk where storms stay more discreet ahead of the main line. I want to be upfront that this is still several days out, so exact placement and timing are going to keep shifting as we get better model resolution. But the overall pattern, a disturbance riding a ridge from the plains into the Ohio Valley over the course of a weekend, loading up on instability the entire way, is a classic setup for exactly this kind of threat expansion. And it's worth taking seriously well before Sunday actually arrives. Away from the main severe threat, there's a separate flooding concern building in the southern Appalachians. A stalled frontal boundary has been sitting over eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina for several days now, and it's going to keep pulling in deep tropical level moisture right through the weekend. Rain rates of 2 to 4 inches per hour are possible in training thunderstorms, meaning storm after storm rolling over the same towns on ground that's already saturated from earlier this week. The terrain in that part of the country funnels water fast into small creeks and low water crossings, so even a couple of hours of training storms can produce dangerous flash flooding well before any river gauge downstream even shows it coming. Right now, that sits at a slight risk for flash flooding, but it's the kind of setup we'll be watching closely for a possible upgrade as the weekend gets closer. Before we get further into the weekend outlook, let's take a quick break, because I want to thank today's sponsor for helping keep these forecasts free and available to everybody who needs them. We all put off things we know we should just take care of, and for a lot of people, that's scheduling a doctor's visit. You call, you get put on hold, and then you're told the next opening is months away, so you just give up and move on with your day. That's exactly the kind of friction today's sponsor is built to remove. Their platform lets you search and compare local in-network doctors all in one place. with real patient reviews and detailed provider profiles, so you can actually find someone who's the right fit before you ever pick up the phone. You can see real appointment openings and book them instantly, right from your phone, and most bookings happen within a day or two, sometimes even same day. It's free to use, and if you've been putting off a checkup, this is about as easy as it gets to stop putting it off. Head over to the link in the description to get started, and thank you again to today's sponsor for supporting the channel. Now let's get back into the forecast. Before we get too far into the weekend, today still has its own separate story brewing out west. There's a slight risk for strong to severe storms this afternoon and evening across the high plains of eastern Colorado and the western Nebraska panhandle. This is a classic high plains supercell setup with steep lapse rates aloft and just enough surface moisture to support a few rotating storms capable of large hail, some of it potentially over 2 inches in diameter, along with isolated damaging wind gusts. There's a low-end tornado risk if any of these storms manage to stay rooted close to a boundary. But the bigger story out here is the hail threat, and if you're anywhere from Sterling to Scottsbluff this evening, that's worth keeping an eye on before you head to bed. Meanwhile, the heat problem that's been building across the southern plains all week isn't going anywhere. Heat indices of 105 to 112 are expected to spread from central Texas up through Oklahoma and into Kansas through the weekend as high pressure strengthens overhead. Overnight lows aren't offering much relief either, with many spots only dropping into the low 80s, meaning bodies don't get the recovery window they need before the heat ramps right back up the next day. That combination, brutal daytime, highs and warm overnight lows, is exactly the kind of pattern that turns dangerous for outdoor workers, athletes, the elderly, and anyone without reliable air conditioning. If you're anywhere in that corridor this weekend, treat it seriously. Hydrate before you're thirsty, take breaks in the shade or indoors during the hottest part of the afternoon, and check in on elderly neighbors who might not have working AC. On the tropical side, there's an area of disturbed weather several hundred miles east of the Lesser Antilles that's being watched for slow development over the next several days. Right now it's disorganized, and wind shear is expected to keep it in check through the weekend, but it's far enough out that it's worth a mention simply because the deep tropics are starting to wake up as we move toward the peak of the season. Nothing actionable yet, but it's the kind of system worth having on your radar heading into next week. There's actually a secondary piece to the Sunday setup that I want to walk through because it changes how confident I am in the overall threat. Beyond just the low-level jet-feeding moisture northward, there's a subtle but important shift happening aloft. The upper-level jet stream is forecast to buckle a bit more sharply by Sunday than earlier model runs suggested, and that extra curvature in the flow tends to increase the amount of spin available in the lower atmosphere. In plain terms, that means the tornado threat on Sunday, while still secondary to the damaging wind threat, is a little higher than it looked even 2 days ago. It's not a widespread tornado outbreak scenario, but a handful of embedded rotating storms, particularly ahead of the main line during the afternoon hours before everything consolidates, is a realistic outcome. That's part of why I keep emphasizing that this is still several days out. A forecast like this one can look completely different by the time we're inside 24 hours of it actually happening, simply because small changes in timing shift how much instability is in place when storms actually arrive. If the line moves through an hour or two earlier than expected, you're dealing with a slightly less unstable atmosphere and a weaker overall threat. If it's delayed by that same hour or two, you're letting the atmosphere destabilize even further, and that tends to support a more intense complex. This is exactly the kind of detail that separates a forecast that looks scary 5 days out from one that actually verifies that way, and it's why I'll keep an eye on the trends daily rather than locking into one outcome this early. One more thing worth mentioning is what happens behind the system once it clears the Ohio Valley Sunday night into Monday. There's some indication that a secondary, weaker disturbance could follow roughly 24 to 36 hours behind the main system, tracking across a very similar path from the Ohio Valley into the mid-Atlantic. If that verifies, places like West Virginia, Western Virginia, and even into the DC and Baltimore corridor could see a second round of storms early in the work week, right on the heels of whatever happens over the weekend. It's too early to have any confidence in timing or severity for that second system, but I wanted to flag it now, so it's not a surprise if the outlook mentions it again in the coming days. Now, pulling all of this together, here's how I'd frame the next several days. Today is about a modest, severe threat over the Central Plains that, on its own, wouldn't be a huge story. But the reason this matters is what comes after it, the same energy driving. Today's storms is forecast to ride east and south over the weekend, picking up instability the entire way. And by the time it reaches the Ohio Valley on Sunday, we're talking about a risk area more than 6 times larger than where this started. That's the expansion in a nutshell. A relatively narrow, unremarkable, severe threat today, turning into a broad, higher confidence threat covering a huge swath of the Midwest and Ohio Valley by Sunday evening. If there's one thing I'd want you to take away from all of this, it's to not anchor too hard on today's forecast and assume that's the whole story. Weather systems like this one build as they travel, and the placement, timing, and intensity are all going to keep getting refined as we get closer to the weekend. If you live anywhere from Kansas City to Columbus to Pittsburgh, I'd keep an eye on the forecast over the next 48 hours, because this is exactly the kind of setup that tends to firm up fast once we get within a day or two of it actually happening. For those of you specifically in that Saturday overnight corridor, from western Missouri into southern Illinois, make sure your phone is actually going to wake you up if a warning comes through while you're asleep. That's the single biggest factor in these overnight severe weather events. People who have a plan and a way to get woken up tend to be fine. People who sleep through it are the ones who get caught off guard, and that's true whether we're talking about damaging straight-line winds or something more serious. And for the flooding concern down in the southern Appalachians, if you live near a creek, a low-water crossing, or anywhere that's flooded before, don't wait for an official warning to start paying attention. Ground that's already saturated doesn't need much additional rain to cause real problems, and training storms can produce those rain totals faster than most people expect. So here's the short version. Today, a modest severe threat over the Central Plains with large hail is the main concern. Saturday, that threat expands significantly into the Ozarks and lower Midwest with a growing damaging wind and overnight severe weather risk. Sunday, the same system pushes into the Ohio Valley, and the overall risk area more than doubles again to cover well over 25 million people from Louisville to Pittsburgh. Layered on top of all of that, a serious flash flooding setup continuing in the southern Appalachians, and a dangerous multi-day heat wave building across the southern plains. This is a pattern worth watching closely over the next few days, not because any single piece of it is unprecedented, but because of how much it's expected to grow as it moves east. I'll keep tracking the model trends and get you updated forecasts as we get closer to the weekend, especially once we're within range of the higher resolution guidance that can nail down the exact timing and placement for Saturday and Sunday. That's the forecast for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure you're staying weather aware if you're anywhere in that path this weekend. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.